Let's start out with a few basics to get us going, and then we'll get into playing more. But we need to start out with talking about a few of the concepts that we'll be mentioning throughout all of these segments. The first one is going to be zones. So the zones, really, if you lay your sticks out in a line about 1.5 inches, 2 inches in front of the rims of drum 1 and drum 2, this should be around where the motion of your beads will travel. It's an approximation. It's not always the same, and there are different philosophies on this, and that's okay. This is just one idea of thinking about it. So obviously we have quints, I call them quads anyway, tenors. All the names are cool, they all work. You also have 2 spocks as well as an option, but here I'm using 5 because I like these heads, I like this tuning. So I have drums 1, 2, 3, and 4, high to low. And I have 1 spock here, a 6-inch spock. You can also have 2 6s, a 6 and an 8, 1 8, or no spock at all. That's totally cool. So I'm looking for as open of a tone as possible. In the case of tone drums, pitched drums, unlike, which snare is not necessarily unpitched. We're more looking for attack on those and less sustain. With quads, timpani, concert toms, those kind of things, we're looking for a pitch here and a sustain. Right now I have my mic placed where it's gonna be very dry because I'm in a very wet room right now. The room is really reverberous, but I have the mic placed where these should sound much drier, so you can hear all the rhythms and the sounds I'm making. Generally we want to hear some tone out of these, right? Right, and you notice as they go up in pitch and as the head is stretched more and more and it's tuned higher, they're much drier. So the drum 4 has plenty of body sound to it, whereas a spock doesn't have as much. These are some things to think about in dynamics or anything like that. Just the general overview of what the drums actually sound like, right? So go back to the zones. So on the zones, you want to try to move in this horizontal line as much as possible. But so if I'm just placing my zones here for a second, I've got my home base. Home base is going to be on 1 and 2. I'll be at a little bit of a downward angle. No tension in my shoulders. My arms are relaxed as if I was playing on 1 drum. Set your beads down and lift them up ever so slightly. That's where your set position should be. It'll be halfway. If you split this drum in half, it'll be halfway like that. And you'll be about 2 inches or 1.5 inches. Same thing goes to the outside drums. I'm about 2 inches out and playing off the bearing edge. I'm placing this between these 2 lugs right here. When I go out to those drums, all I'm moving, we'll show this later into our vertical and horizontal motion. We'll talk about that in a bit. I'm only moving from my shoulders. I'm not breaking my wrist to move at all. So I'm moving anything above my elbow, which gets me to my next topic, which is vertical and horizontal axes, right? So if you're thinking about a coordinate plane, right, you have the 4 quadrants, and you have these 2 lines that are going infinite both ways. We're thinking about a vertical axis, the y-axis, and our x-axis, the horizontal axis. So when I say y-axis or your vertical axis or the vertical plane, anything like that, I'm just meaning where your stick is, and anything you play on any rhythm, any 1 drum thing, like anything like this, that's all a vertical motion. There's no horizontal motion to it, right? There's no around going to it. Now, if I talk about the x-axis or the horizontal axis, there's actually this other plane of horizontal motion where I could be playing vertically, just quarter notes or eighth notes or whatever, but I'm moving horizontally around the drums, right? So I'm moving this way, which is my horizontal axis. Vertical, horizontal, right? So when you say, like, what do snare drums do? They play on 1 vertical axis. Bass drums are on a similar thing. They're playing a vertical, but it's horizontal in the bass drum land. They're playing one direction, right? We actually have to move around a little bit. Also applies really well to mallet instruments, whereas on marimba, vibraphone, or xylophone, or whatever, you're playing up and down motion, but you're also going between the manuals, and you're going side to side the entire time. Say a mallet instrument, there's another issue of you have 2 manuals. You have the flats and sharps on the top, and then you have the naturals on the bottom, which means you got to move here and here. The same thing applies to quads. We call this the z-axis or the sagittal plane or whatever. Those are all big words for just the front and back, right? So I have side to side, I have up and down, and I have front and back. This should rarely apply when it comes to playing across the main 4 drums. But when you play on a spock, there's a sort of front-back motion that happens there. And the way we want to think about moving in that is just pulling the arms back a little bit, right? Pulling the elbows back. You don't want to break the wrist again. And that's a huge thing, is that like the whole point of this kind of opening segment is that we're looking to maintain the way we play on all 4 of these drums, or 5 or 6 or whatever, the same way we play on 1 drum. So when you start anything ever, forever and always, you're starting on 1 drum only, right? Starting on just 1 drum, 2, 1, whatever, and then move it to the arounds, right? The reason we use drum 2 for a lot of these things is because it's a more separated voice than the rest of the drums, right? Around here, we kind of blend into the bass drums, and around here, we kind of blend in the snares. So when we're playing on drum 2, you can kind of hear that mid-range where the snares sit above us and the basses are right below us in the frequencies. So now that gets me into the setup a little more. You know, we're at drums 1 and 2 as our home base. When you're on any drum, the important thing is that your beads are together. I'm not really concerned about these angles. More that the beads are together and in the right zone, and you maintain this kind of arching shape to your arm, it should line up where we want it to be. So if I just have my beads together there, there, keeping the beads together on each drum. I'm looking for these like ideal zones, these 2 little dots on each drum. You've seen a lot of diagrams. I'll probably show them in the video right now. Or like a little like oval or something like that. That's what we're kind of aiming for. And on the Spock, there's different camps here. Because this is a 6-inch Spock, it's smaller and there's just 5 drums. I'm just kind of thinking center of the head. I mean, maybe a little forward, but not really. You'll see a lot of 2 Spocks, and there's a 6-inch and an 8-inch. The 8-inch, you'll usually play a little forward, get a little more tone out of it. But the idea is that these all have a nodal point, which is the point of least pitch on each drum. So that's the center of each. Right? You hear that? That sounds awful, right? You want to aim for that more 2-inch closer to the rim or bearing edge. It's much more full-bodied pitch that we can discern from it, and it's not this kind of thumpy sound. No, on a snare drum, that's ideal. We're looking for a lot of articulation, very little pitch. Same with the bass drum, they ring out a ton, so we want to make that as much attack bass as possible and not as much resonant. So for these though, we're aiming to get away from the nodal point. So the worst place you can ever hit is the exact center of every head. And it gets better as you go out, right? You notice at some point there, it gets a little tinny towards the bearing edge. You want to move out, find that sweet spot. A little too much there. Right, so you actually have a little bit of leeway. It's not like it has to be exactly on these 2 dots. Some people care more about zones than others. It's 2 things. It's 1, we want to make sure that we're getting as good of a sound of the drums possible. And then 2, that we're moving as efficiently as possible. We'll see through a lot of these videos that the main idea is that we're just not wasting energy, we're being efficient, and we're making good sounds. Efficiency and good sounds is really the most important thing about quads. It's the only 2 things that ever really matter, along with playing in time, right? But making good sounds and efficiency of motion.